We're about to watch a crazy debate most people know about with William Lane Craig and Ben Shapiro, but William Lane Craig has never discussed this conversation actually on his thoughts in the aftermath of the conversation until just a few months ago. I just watched an interview where he expressed his thoughts on that video. So I'm going to show what his response was in a moment, but I want to show you the setup of that so you can see what the context of his entire response is. This is the only time I've ever seen Ben Shapiro really get upset and really speechless over something. So let's watch this.
Who do you think Jesus of Nazareth was? Jesus claimed to be the decisive self-revelation of God. And I believe that we have good reasons to believe that those claims were true, and that therefore the God revealed by Jesus of Nazareth exists.
Okay, so let's get into that. Okay. So what is the proof that Jesus was who he says he is in the Gospels?
Well, first we need to establish who he thought he was. When you look at the religio-historical context of the life and ministry of Jesus, I think you can show that among the historically authentic words of Jesus were claims that he thought he was the Jewish Messiah, that he believed himself to be the Son of God in a unique sense that set him apart from Jewish kings and prophets, and finally that he thought that he was the Son of Man predicted by the prophet Daniel, to whom God would give all dominion, power, and authority. So he had this radical self-understanding of being Messiah, Son of God, and the Son of Man. And at the trial scene before the Sanhedrin in Mark 15, all three of these titles come to a head when the high priest asks him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One, that is the Son of God?" And Jesus says, "I am." And then virtually quoting from Daniel, "And you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven and seated at the right hand of the power."
If you know Daniel 7, by the way, which is what he just quoted about Son of Man, this is the most blasphemous thing you could say, because that's saying, "I am God." He's saying that there's this chariot that the Ancient of Days is sitting on, which is God. And he's like, that was me. That's me that's doing that. So this is where the moment where he rips, the high priest rips his cloak and slaps him in the face and says that he is guilty of blasphemy. This is the moment when he calls himself God, as in saying the Son of Man. You can watch plenty of other videos on deep dive into the Son of Man context, but that's what he's referring to here.
And at that point, the high priest rips his robes and says, "You have heard the blasphemy. What more witnesses do we need?" And Mark says they all condemned him as worthy of death. And that enabled them, since they didn't have the ability to carry out capital punishment, to deliver him over to the Roman authorities by slandering him as a pretender to be king of the Jews, and therefore a political figure who could be tried for treason and sedition and crucified.
So from the Jewish perspective, this narrative has some holes in sort of Jewish philosophy. The narrative begins with the idea that Jesus appears in front of the Sanhedrin and then claims to be the Messiah. Well, there's nothing actual criminally in any of the tractates that say that if you declare yourself the Messiah, this is actually a punishable offense even. Right. There are many Jews, including Bar Kokhba, who have declared themselves messianic figures. The real gap here is that in the Gospels, Jesus' vision of himself as the Messiah is completely different from the prior vision of what the Jewish Messiah is, and is actually outside the scope of how Jews describe the Messiah, or really have ever described the Messiah. The Messiah in Judaism has always been a political figure who is destined to do certain things, restoring the kingdom of Israel, maintaining control of that kingdom, bringing more Jews back to Israel. All of these things are considered sort of political things that the Messiah does. But the idea of the Messiah as embodiment of God is something that's foreign to Jewish religious philosophy.
He's right in the sense of many Jews are confused and deceived on this point. Like he is like textbook falling into exactly what Scripture says Jews will have confusion about.
Going all the way back to the beginning. So even the idea that the Sanhedrin would be questioning him in those terms and would get from that what he means is, "I am God," which would be a much more punishable offense. Presumably that'd be actual blasphemy.
Again, if you know Daniel 7, you'll know that calling yourself Son of Man and calling yourself Messiah are different. It is a fact that Christ, Messiah, Son of God, these are not exclusively divine claims. These claims can be made about plenty of different people and have been made about plenty of different people, right? David was a son of God. So like these are not exclusively divine blasphemous claims if they were to not be true. Those wouldn't be of any offense. They could be wrong, but they're not of any offense. But calling yourself the Son of Man is the only one of those.
It's an oddity.
I think you're absolutely right in saying that Jesus' understanding of the Messiah was radically different from the prevailing cultural understanding of the Messiah among the chief priests and the common people. And he didn't meet their expectations. Indeed, that's what helped to get him crucified. being the Messiah, you're right, in and of itself isn't a blasphemous claim. But to claim to be the Son of God in a unique sense, and then especially the Son of Man prophesied by Daniel, sitting at the right hand of the power, that is truly blasphemous and is sufficient for his condemnation. Now, the question, I think, that is raised by your question, Ben,
yes.
your interpretation, Ben, is this. Why should we believe Jesus' reinterpretation of the Messiah rather than the one that the chief priests and the people held? And I think the answer to that.
This is what the crux of the argument is on. This is what, like, us as Christians, when we're talking to non-believers, this should be the focal point. It's nothing that's been said to this point. That's just a confusion in a Jewish mind. But this point that we're about to talk about right now, this is the crux of Christianity.
That is his resurrection from the dead. Jesus' resurrection from the dead is Yahweh's public and unequivocal vindication of the man whom the chief priests had rejected as a blasphemer. It is the divine demonstration that these allegedly blasphemous claims are in fact true, that he was who he claimed to be, and that therefore I follow Jesus in his conception of what it means to be the Messiah.
So when it comes to the resurrection, why is resurrection proof of divinity? So Lazarus is resurrected.
That was why I wanted to emphasize the religio-historical context before we talked about the resurrection. A miracle taken in isolation is inherently ambiguous. The proper interpretation of a miracle is going to be given by the religio-historical context in which it occurs. And the resurrection of Jesus is not just the resurrection of any old body. It's the resurrection of the man who claimed to be Messiah, Son of God, and Son of Man, and who was crucified for those allegedly blasphemous claims.
And I don't remember if he mentioned this or not. And he also prophesied that this was going to come to be, and he called himself God. So it's like not even remotely close to compare that to Lazarus. Also, I'm going to show you, again, William Lane Craig's response to his, to this video and what he thought of the debate in just a moment.
If God has raised this man from the dead, then he has, I think, unequivocally and publicly vindicated those allegedly blasphemous claims.
So one of the counterclaims to some of this is that the Gospels are written significantly after Jesus lives. Even the earliest Gospel is written, 70 CE? Somewhere 40 years after Jesus is crucified. So what's to say, that like most historical events, there is some play in the joints here. So that this would be the historical argument against the exact veracity of the Gospel revelations, for example.
Now, I think it's important to understand, Ben, that in order for a historical document to be reliable, it isn't required that it be inerrant.
Contemporaneous, of course.
So,
of course.
What I would argue is that underlying the inference to the resurrection of Jesus are three great independently established facts, which are supported by the historical evidence, and which surprisingly, I did my doctoral work on this in Germany, are recognized as such by the majority of New Testament scholars today who study the historical Jesus. And these facts would be that after his crucifixion and burial by a member of the Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea, that Jesus' tomb was discovered empty on the first day of the week by a group of his female followers. Secondly would be that various individuals and groups of people then witnessed appearances of Jesus alive. And finally, number three would be that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead, despite having every predisposition to the contrary. The vast majority of scholars have come to accept as convincing the evidence in support of those three facts, not assuming biblical inerrancy or inspiration, but treating the Gospels as ordinary historical documents. You can show, for example, that the fact of the discovery of the empty tomb is attested by at least 6 independent sources in the New Testament, some of which are extraordinarily early. No scholar denies that individuals and groups saw post-mortem appearances of Jesus. The only question is whether you should or could dismiss them as hallucinatory. And again, nobody denies that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead. So these three facts are
enough to the point where they would be murdered on behalf of this man, who they would have known whether genuinely did die and rise again from the dead or not. They would have known that or not. And that's the whole, context in which they were killed for, is them saying, being beaten and tortured, burned alive, maybe boiled alive. In the midst of that, they still said, I'm still not going to reject this Jesus. By that point, you'd probably be like, okay, fine. Okay, yeah, it was wrong. I was making it all up. Just get me off this cross. but they chose not to for some reason.
Pretty firmly established, and the only question is then how do you best explain them? And down through history, attempts have been made to explain these facts without recourse to the resurrection, like the conspiracy theory, the apparent death theory, the hallucination theory, and so forth. And I would argue that none of these naturalistic theories meets the criteria for being the best historical explanation of the facts. None of them is as good an explanation as the one that the original disciples gave, that God raised Jesus from the dead. And if that's right, then I think we have good grounds, indeed are almost compelled to revise our typical understanding of who the Messiah was supposed to be.
So we can have the historical argument back and forth, obviously, and I think that there are arguments that you can make. I think there are arguments that I can make, but I honestly find them relatively uninteresting, is the truth, simply because I'm not sure that we're going to come to any sort of consensus on them.
No.
You know, on the historical argument, for example, I think it's fairly easy to claim there's a sect of Judaism right now in which there's a small subsection of people who believe that the Lubavitcher Rebbe is still alive. Right? The Lubavitcher Rebbe passed away in the 1990s,
yes.
and there's still people who treat him as though he is not dead. They call him the Messiah. They think that he was the political Messiah. They have and they still do that 20 years after his death. You know that.
Did you catch what he said there? He said, I don't particularly find talking about the historicity of Jesus very interesting. How can you talk about Jesus without talking about the historicity of Jesus? Because the only other option you have is to talk about the divinity of Jesus and what the biblical texts say exclusively about Jesus. You don't want that, because then you're just going to play the argument of, oh, well, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You're just saying it's true because God said it was true. So you need to have the historicity of Jesus as a discussion for it to have any real grounds outside of just saying, well, because God said it's true means it's true. So what an interesting skirt by Ben Shapiro here.
It's not proof to me that he is actually alive. Some of them claim to have experienced it, right? So, you know, especially when you're talking about events 2,000 years ago, if people write that down, I think there's sufficient.
I doubt this man's tomb is empty.
I mean, I haven't dug him up, so I wouldn't know. But the claims, if somebody claimed 2,000 years from now that his tomb was empty, or claimed 70 years from now that his tomb was empty, then
that's an important difference, Ben. The important time gap is not the gap between the events and the present. Good evidence doesn't become bad evidence just because of the lapse of time. The critical event, as you just said, is the time gap between the events and the recording of those events. And in the case of the events of the life of Jesus and his resurrection, that time gap is extraordinarily narrow. We can push back even before the writing of the Gospels and the epistles of Paul by discerning the traditions upon which they relied when they wrote. And some of these go back to within, it's estimated, 5 years after Jesus' crucifixion. I'm thinking of the ones that Paul transmits to the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians 15. So we're on pretty good ground there in terms of the earliness and the multiplicity of our sources for the life of Jesus.
That was the end of the conversation. He just forced them to go into a different area, because obviously Ben had no answer. The two attempts of objections that he made, William Lane Craig shot both of them down, to which then Ben Shapiro agreed that the means of Ben Shapiro's arguments were fundamentally flawed. So now let's look at what William Lane Craig says years later from that conversation happening here. Let's see what he has to say.
More of a personal question, Bill.
Sorry, I always listen to things faster than I should.
Because what you've described is obviously an important part of the Christian understanding of the gospel and what it means to accept Christ. So you can, if this pries too much into personal conversations, feel free to say. But Keegan wants to know, what was it like talking to Ben Shapiro, a well-known talk show host who is Jewish himself by background, especially in regards to the gospel? I know that you obviously had an interview on Ben Shapiro's show, Bill. Can you share anything about sort of what you felt, how the conversation went, and how
I can say that I found him to be very congenial, really a friendly, casual fellow, not at all self-important or presumptuous. We really hit it off well. And I noticed that when he started pressing me about the resurrection of Jesus and I started laying out the evidence, he retreated very quickly and changed the subject, which I thought was sort of interesting. But I greatly enjoyed our conversation.
Obviously, he's going to be kind, but he also obviously noted that when he brought up these undisputable facts that scholars agree upon, that he immediately wanted to skirt out of the conversation, because there's really not a whole lot of other grounds that you can go on. It shows that not only is Ben Shapiro uneducated in those areas, but also that there's not a tremendous amount of disputes. I mean, as William Lane Craig had mentioned, the only 4 seriously taken kind of jabs at the resurrection are rather weak. The number one, as he'd mentioned, I believe in this video, was the hallucination argument. That's really the number one that they have. And man, the ability for that to happen to so many people who all seem to see the same thing, that was so convincing, again, that they would die for that hallucination. Man, I mean, I'm just trying to think of the amount of hallucinations that I've seen in my life, or know other people who have seen in their lives, who are especially not on shrooms, acid, or otherwise. Man, it's very, very minimal. It's very minimal, the amount of supposed hallucinations that people claim to see. And again, to literally bet your life on that hallucination on top of that is very, very unlikely. So love William Lane Craig, love his work. And I think that we need more people like him who are thought leaders in the Christian space, helping promote the gospel to other people.